Something extraordinary just happened inside the United States Senate, and it did not happen quietly. It did not happen behind closed doors with polite handshakes and careful whispers exchanged between powerful men who have spent decades learning how to protect each other. It happened loudly, it happened publicly, and it happened in a way that John Thune probably never saw coming, not in his worst nightmares. Not after all the years he spent carefully climbing to the top of the Senate's power structure. The Senate Majority Leader, the most powerful Republican in the upper chamber of the United States Congress, is now facing open, organized, and escalating calls for his resignation. Not from Democrats, not from the mainstream media, not from political opponents looking to score cheap points, from his own party, from the very people who are supposed to be standing right beside him, from JD Vance allies, from Senate Republicans, from the grassroots movement that has been building pressure at the base of the America First coalition for months, growing louder and more determined with every passing week. And now that pressure has reached the front door of his Washington office. It has reached the Senate floor, it has reached the White House, and it is not going away. This is not a minor political disagreement that gets smoothed over with a carefully worded press release and a few handshakes in the Capitol hallway. This is not the kind of typical Washington spat that gets forgotten by the following news cycle. This is a full, coordinated, multi-front pressure campaign aimed directly at forcing John Thune out of his leadership position. And the people leading that campaign are not fringe figures operating from the outside. They are senators, they are White House allies, they are nationally recognized movement organizers with millions of loyal supporters standing behind every word they say. So what exactly happened? What did John Thune do? Or more precisely, what did he fail to do that brought this moment crashing down on him like a wave that has been building for a very long time? And more importantly, where does this go from here? Because the answer to that question affects every single American who believes their vote should be protected, their voice should be heard, and their elected leaders should actually deliver on. And the promises they made. You are watching Truth Uploads. If this kind of story matters to you, and it should, hit the like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear the truth. Because what you are about to hear is only the beginning of a story that is still unfolding in real time. Let us go back to where this started. The Save America Act, a piece of legislation that sounds simple on its surface. You must prove you are an American citizen and show a valid government-issued photo ID when you cast your vote. That is the whole idea. Clean, simple, common sense. And yet that one bill has become the flashpoint for one of the most intense and revealing political battles happening right now inside the Republican Party itself. A battle that has now put John Thune directly in the crosshairs of the very movement he was supposed to be serving. John Thune is not a villain in the traditional political sense. He is not a screamer, he is not a chaos agent, he is not someone who goes out of his way to make enemies or pick unnecessary fights. He is exactly the kind of Republican leader who has survived for decades in Washington by being steady, measured, careful, and above all, cautious. When he took the Senate Majority Leader position, his entire instinct was to manage the institution, to stabilize its rhythms, to slow walk the big issues through what he considered to be proper order and responsible procedure. But here is the brutal truth that is now impossible to ignore. That instinct, the one that served him for years, has become the single biggest obstacle standing between the American people and the results they were promised. Because right now, the voters who gave Republicans everything, the Senate, the House, and the White House, are not in the mood for steady. They are not looking for cautious. They are not interested in managed timelines and procedural patience. They are furious. They feel betrayed. They handed the Republican Party total unified control of the federal government, and what they expected in return was not careful management. It was results, actual, tangible, historic results that they could point to and say, we did this, we voted, we won, and things changed. And nowhere is that frustration more visible, more raw, and more politically explosive than around the Save America Act. Here is what makes this so difficult for Thune to defend. Republican senators, 3, maybe 4 of them, have been quietly blocking the procedural moves needed to advance this bill. Using the old rules, hiding behind the old Senate traditions, creating enough resistance to keep the bill from getting a clean path to a floor vote, and Thune, instead of using the full weight of his leadership position to force the issue, has been playing by those same old rules, respecting those same old traditions, treating the Senate's customs as though they were sacred, even when those customs are being used as weapons against the people's will. One senator said it directly and on the record, there are only 45 or 46 Republicans willing to actually fight politically to get the Save America Act passed, and that number should be 53. Every single Republican senator marching together, but it is not. And the gap between what that number is and what it should be represents a failure of leadership that the movement is no longer willing to quietly accept. Scott Presler, one of the most visible and effective grassroots organizers in the country, showed up outside Thune's Washington, D.C. office on camera. He said he had tried to be diplomatic. He had worked with members of Congress. He had reached across the aisle. He had played nice, extended good faith, and kept the temperature low. And yet, here they were in May of 2026 with the Save America Act still not passed, still not law, still sitting there while the old guard found new reasons to delay. His message to John Thune was clear. His patience was done. What Scott Presler said next was not a suggestion. It was not a polite request. It was not the kind of softly worded appeal that gets noted and then ignored. It was a direct, unambiguous ultimatum issued publicly to John Thune and to every Republican senator who has been dragging their feet on delivering the America First agenda that voters sent them to Washington to pass. Give us the Save America Act or lose your seats. He was standing right outside Thune's office, and he said it without hesitation. If the Senate Majority Leader will not give the people what they want, then the people will peacefully take away what he has. His allies, his supporters, his political infrastructure, one by one, primary by primary, election by election. He called on supporters to show up that Saturday in Louisiana and send a message. He endorsed Attorney General Ken Paxton against Senator John Cornyn in Texas, citing Cornyn's record on red flag laws, his history of supporting amnesty measures, and his position on deportation relief. And then he turned the full weight of his message back toward Thune. Send a clear and decisive message to Senate Majority Leader Thune. If you do not pass what we want as the majority, you are going to lose with meticulous precision, colleague after colleague, until you give us what we want. Peacefully game on. Meticulous precision. Sit with those words for a moment, because this is not rage. This is not blind frustration expressing itself in noise. This is a carefully framed strategy. A calculated, organized, deliberately paced effort to remove support from any Republican leader who refuses to deliver, not with violence, not with chaos, but with votes, with primaries, with organized citizens showing up at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right places to make change happen. And the warning echoed far beyond one rally outside one Senate office, because Senator Roger Marshall's office responded with a statement that should have rattled every complacent Republican in Washington. Quote, "We should explore every possible avenue to get the Save America Act passed into law. If that means utilizing the talking filibuster, he supports it." A sitting United States Senator publicly endorsing a procedural maneuver that would fundamentally restructure one of the Senate's most powerful traditions in order to get this specific bill done for the American people. Marshall was not alone. Multiple senators have now come out in support of the talking filibuster approach, which means the ground beneath John Thune's feet is shifting faster than his team may realize. And the next development took this story somewhere nobody expected. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people outside Washington's inner circles simply did not see coming. A development that changed the temperature of this fight completely and signaled that the pressure on John Thune was no longer just coming from the outside looking in. JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, the man who sits one heartbeat from the presidency, one of the sharpest and most strategically minded political figures in the entire Trump administration. He had been watching the stalemate develop from his unique constitutional position, because the Vice President is not just a ceremonial figure in relation to the Senate. He is the President of the Senate. He is the presiding officer. He holds the constitutional authority inside that chamber that goes far beyond what most people understand or appreciate. And serious, credible voices, people with real knowledge of Senate procedure and constitutional law, began asking a question that nobody had asked quite so directly before. What if JD Vance simply walked into the Senate chamber and started making rulings himself? The legal framework for this is real, and it is significant. When the Vice President sits in the presiding officer's chair, he holds the authority to make procedural rulings in the moment, ruling by ruling, motion by motion. He receives advice from the Senate parliamentarian. He can hear that advice carefully, and then he can choose to rule however he determines is appropriate. He is not legally bound to follow the parliamentarian's guidance. The chair has power, real power, power that has largely sat unused because previous vice presidents either did not want to use it or did not need to. One prominent voice in this conversation laid it out plainly. There is significant and underutilized authority that comes with sitting in that chair. Just the ability to call the shots from moment to make procedural rulings, not necessarily always guided by the advice of the parliamentarian. The presiding officer, especially the vice president, can do what he wants. And Vance has already demonstrated he is willing to act. When Pete Hegseth's confirmation vote ended in a 50-50 deadlock, with the Senate perfectly divided down partisan lines, Vance walked in and cast the deciding vote. The nomination was confirmed. He did not hesitate. He did not look for reasons to stay on the sidelines. He showed up, he acted, and he made history. So the question was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. Would he do it again? The answer, shockingly and unmistakably, was yes, at least according to the people who are closest to this fight and most familiar with what is being discussed inside the halls of power. Not just from outside commentators speculating about what might be possible, from people with real credibility, real standing, and real connections to the decision makers inside the White House and the Senate. One voice, speaking directly and without any diplomatic softening, said he believed John Thune was, on this specific issue, a piece of garbage, worthless. He did not reach for gentle language. He did not apologize for the directness, and then he said the quiet part loud in a way that spread across every corner of political media within hours. He would encourage the White House to send JD Vance directly to the Senate to assume this presiding officer role. And if the Vice President was constitutionally able to walk through that door and say, and here are the actual words that have now been heard by millions of people, Thune, sit down. Here's what we're going to do. Then it should be done, without delay, without hesitation, without another round of negotiations that go nowhere. Thune, sit down. 2 words. And the moment they were spoken, something shifted in the political atmosphere around this story, because that phrase does not just describe a procedural possibility. It describes a humiliation, a public, institutional, and deeply personal humiliation for a man who built his entire career on being the adult in the room and the stabilizing force, the respected figure who kept things running smoothly. to be told by allies of the sitting vice president on the public record that he should sit down and be quiet while someone else takes over. That is not normal Washington politics. That is a full-scale challenge to his authority, his competence, and his right to lead. And it did not stop there, because what followed was a cascade of voices, each one adding weight to the demand. Senators, movement leaders, constitutional scholars, grassroots organizers, all arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. John Thune was not leading, he was blocking. And the people who put Republicans in power were no longer willing to pretend otherwise. If you have not shared this video yet, right now is the moment, because what comes next reveals just how deep this fracture really goes. To truly understand why this pressure campaign has reached the level it has, why the calls for Thune's resignation are not just loud but coordinated, not just emotional but strategic, you have to look beneath the surface of the Save America Act, debate and understand what is really driving all of this. Because the bill is a symbol, an important one, a real one, but it is the symbol of something much larger that has been building for a long time inside. The coalition that brought Donald Trump back to the White House. It is a fundamental question about what Republican leadership actually means, and whether the people currently holding that leadership have the will to use it. Voters gave Republicans the House. They gave Republicans the Senate. They gave Republicans the White House. With Donald Trump leading the charge for the second time, they handed the party total, unified, historic control of the federal government. And the expectation, the explicit, stated campaign trail promise, was that this time things would actually change, not incrementally, not carefully, not with one eye always on what the opposition press might say tomorrow. Actually change, big, bold, real results that the American people could feel in their daily lives. Instead, what many in the movement have watched is a Senate that moves slowly, protects its own internal customs, finds procedural reasons to delay, holds hearings without scheduling floor votes, and treats urgency as though it were a character flaw rather than a response to a genuine national moment. One voice inside the movement described it without any softening. These Republicans like being in leadership, but they don't like leading. And he gave a specific, concrete example that reveals the problem perfectly. A bill to defund the Taliban, stopping $40 million per week that the United States was still sending to them, had passed committee. It was ready. It was sitting there, and the Senate would not schedule it for a floor vote. $40 million every single week going to the Taliban, and the Senate would not move. That is the kind of thing that does not just frustrate people. It breaks trust. It makes ordinary Americans look at their elected officials and wonder whether Washington is simply broken, or whether the people running it actually prefer it broken, because broken means no accountability, and no accountability means safety for the people already holding power. And John Thune has become the face of that broken status quo, not because he is corrupt, not because he is malicious, but because he has chosen comfort over urgency at the exact moment that urgency was needed most. Here is the argument that Thune's defenders cannot answer, and they have tried. They have reached for procedural explanations and coalition management theories and careful talk about Senate traditions. But none of it addresses the single most devastating fact at the center of this entire debate. 84% of Americans support the Save America Act, not 84% of Republicans, not 84% of conservatives, and 84% of all Americans across party lines, across demographic groups, across every region of this country, support requiring proof of citizenship and a valid photo ID to cast a vote in a federal election. Break it down further and the numbers are just as striking. 85% of white Americans support it, 82% of Latino Americans support it, 76% of Black Americans support it. When you combine Republicans and Democrats together on the basic question of voter ID, that number climbs to 86%. This is not a controversial position. It is not a fringe idea. It is not a partisan power grab dressed up in a populist language. It is the overwhelming consensus of the American public on a basic question of election integrity and the opposition to it. That opposition is essentially the Democratic Party leadership and a handful of Republicans who have found reasons to go along with the obstruction rather than stand up against it. One voice made a comparison that cut straight through the noise. He referenced Jimmy Carter, not as a compliment to Carter's presidency, but as a reminder that Carter commissioned a bipartisan commission on election integrity. And that commission's primary finding was clear and unambiguous. Mail-in voting, as practiced in the United States, is prone to fraud and should be curtailed. This was a bipartisan conclusion, reached by serious people with no political incentive to arrive at it, and it was largely ignored. But here is the question that has started echoing everywhere, the one that nobody on the other side has successfully answered. If illegal non-citizen voting is so rare, as Democrats constantly insist, then why fight so hard against a law designed to prevent it? If it almost never happens, what exactly are they protecting by blocking a bill that addresses it? Why go to the mat against something that, by their own account, barely exists? The contradiction is glaring, and every time it goes unanswered, more Americans conclude that the opposition is not principled. It is strategic, it is deliberate, and that conclusion is exactly what has made the pressure campaign around John Thune feel not just justified but necessary. Now here is what the mainstream political coverage of this story has almost entirely missed, and it may be the most significant development of all. Because the narrative has been framed primarily around outside pressure, the grassroots, the movement figures, the voices pushing from beyond the Senate walls. But there is something else happening inside the chamber itself that tells a far more revealing story about where Republican politics is actually heading right now. Senators are breaking ranks publicly on the record in ways that directly challenge the approach John Thune has taken as majority leader. Multiple sitting Republican senators have now publicly endorsed using the talking filibuster to force the Save America Act to a floor vote. That is not a small procedural footnote. The filibuster has been one of the most powerful and jealously protected traditions in the entire history of the United States Senate. For a senator to stand up and say the chamber should restructure how it uses that tradition, specifically to move this specific bill forward for the American people, is a significant statement. It means those senators have looked at the situation, evaluated their options, and concluded that following Thune's patient, traditional approach is no longer defensible. Roger Marshall put his name behind the talking filibuster publicly, and his office made clear that he supported exploring every possible avenue to get this done. Every possible avenue. That is language that leaves nothing off the table. And then there are the elections. Primaries are being organized, coordinated, endorsed by major national figures with real mobilizing power. Scott Presler's endorsement of Ken Paxton against Cornyn. Texas was not a random act. It was a demonstration of what the movement is willing to do when senators refuse to deliver. The Louisiana race, where a Republican senator had voted to convict Donald Trump during the impeachment trial, became another test case, another data point in a growing pattern of accountability being enforced at the ballot box. The message being sent to every Republican senator watching from their offices is simple and unmistakable. The movement will find your primary. It will find your opponent. It will show up in your state with energy and organization, and a clear message about why you need to go. This is not a threat being made from a position of weakness. The infrastructure exists, the funding is available, the energy is real, and it is growing. And John Thune knows all of this, every single part of it. which makes his continued resistance to moving aggressively on the Save America Act not just frustrating to the movement, it makes it baffling. And baffling is the most dangerous place for a political leader to be. So what actually happens now? Because the pressure campaign is not slowing down. If anything, the events of the past several days suggest it is accelerating, picking up speed, picking up participants, and picking up institutional weight that makes it harder and harder for Thune and his defenders to wave away as noise from the fringes. The calls for his resignation are now arriving simultaneously from multiple directions at once. The grassroots mobilization, the procedural porks inside the Senate itself, the White House adjacent voices who are openly discussing JD Vance's constitutional options, the senators who have publicly broken with Thune's approach on the filibuster question, and the ordinary American voters who are watching all of this unfold and asking with completely legitimate frustration why a bill supported by 86% of the country cannot pass the Senate, controlled by the party that promised to pass it. That is not a fringe coalition. That is a broad, multi-layered, serious political force applying coordinated pressure in a direction that only leads one place. If Thune does not change course, and the JD Vance factor is not fading from the conversation, if anything, it is becoming more central to it. The Vice President has already demonstrated that he is willing to step into the Senate at the most critical moments and use his constitutional authority without hesitation. The Pete Hegseth confirmation is the proof 50-50, the Senate perfectly divided. Vance walks in, sits down, votes yes, and the nomination is confirmed. Done. He did not look for reasons to stay away. He showed up and acted. The conversation now happening in public, happening loudly, is whether he will do the same for the Save America Act, whether he will walk into that chamber, take his seat in the presiding officer's chair, and begin making the procedural rulings that could break the logjam and force this bill to a vote. People close to both the White House and the Senate say those conversations are happening and that the Vice President is engaged with what is unfolding, that the patience for waiting on Thune to move on his own schedule is running out at the highest levels of the administration. Add to this the election calendar, Texas, Louisiana, and other states with upcoming primaries, and what you have is a series of moments where the movement's ability to deliver on its promises gets tested in real time. Each result either builds momentum or reveals limits. But given the polling numbers, given the breadth of public support for the Save America Act, the political risk of pushing this bill forward is nowhere near as great as the political risk of continuing to block it, and Thune has to reckon with that math eventually, because it is not going away. There is a moment in every major political battle when the pressure that has been building in the background finally breaks through and becomes the story itself, when it stops being something the establishment can manage or ignore or quietly outlast and starts defining the entire landscape around it. That moment has arrived for John Thune, and the evidence is everywhere. He's not facing isolated criticism from one corner of the movement. He is facing a coordinated, multi-front, institutionally serious political reckoning that reaches from the grassroots base all the way up to the office of the Vice President of the United States. His allies are being targeted in primary races with precision and purpose. His authority as Senate Majority Leader is being challenged from within his own caucus by colleagues who have decided that loyalty to the institution's traditions means less than loyalty to the people who sent them there. His procedural approach, the slow, careful, tradition-respecting style he built his career on, is being described by serious people on the record as inadequate and out of touch with the urgency of this political moment, And now the idea that JD Vance could simply walk into the Senate and effectively render Thune's resistance irrelevant, using constitutional authority that has always existed but has rarely been wielded with this kind of purpose, is being discussed not as a hypothetical but as a real and imminent possibility. Think carefully about what all of this means in totality. The Vice President of the United States, serving as the mechanism that bypasses the Senate Majority Leader's obstruction, using constitutional authority, while that same Majority Leader faces simultaneous calls from within his own party to step down from leadership entirely, his colleagues telling the country in public statements and on-camera interviews that his leadership is not working, that the American people deserve better, and that the time for patience has expired. This is humiliation, political humiliation, institutional humiliation, personal humiliation, for a man who built his entire public identity on being the steady, respected, responsible voice in the room. And it is happening because the moment demanded something he was not willing to give. The Save America Act is not radical. It is not complicated. It is not even close to controversial when you look at the actual numbers. 86% of Americans crossing every demographic line, supporting the basic premise of verifying citizenship and requiring photo ID to vote. The Senate has the votes, or is close enough that determined leadership could get there. The White House is behind it. The grassroots is demanding it, with the kind of organized energy that changes elections. There is no version of this story where blocking that bill is good politics or good governance. And the people who delivered this moment, who stood outside Senate offices, who endorsed primary challengers, who called for the Vice President to walk through that door and say the words that millions of Americans have been waiting to hear, they are not backing down. The demand is on the table, the pressure is real, and the clock on John Thune's leadership is ticking louder than it ever has before. This is Truth Uploads. If this story moved you, if you believe the American people deserve leaders who actually fight for them, take 5 seconds right now to like this video, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. The fight for election integrity and real Senate leadership is happening right now, in real time. Stay with us, because this story is far from over.